The campaign is a social media campaign, but it's really supporting a bill introduced by Senator Jessica Ramos out of New York City. And her bill effectively bans law enforcement from using drones for recording or collecting data on the general public within open spaces, which includes parks, concert spaces, and protests. The bill would also severely restrict any governmental use of drones without a warrant and ban the use of facial recognition. So, drones for good, drones for public safety, it's incredibly important. We talk about, some of these great use cases on this podcast and at other InterDrone content that we produce a lot. Public safety is a big sector that we work with. Patrick, I know you have a lot of experience in public safety as well. I mean, what do you think of this bill introduced by Senator Ramos? Where do we draw the line as a society, and how do we make sure we're not allowing government overreach, but at the same time, we're getting the value from this technology and from these tools?
Sure. I think that takes, frankly, a very nuanced approach. And unfortunately, nuance is not something our legislators seem to do real well. But we had more or less this exact same debate here in Oregon 5 years ago. And I hope that maybe what we did here can sort of be an exemplar to them. Let me begin by saying I'm 100% sympathetic with this impulse. I don't want to be spied on by a drone. I suspect none of you do either. I mean, so there's that. And then if anything, I think the last month or so has taught us that who you are and what color your skin is really colors the sort of interactions you have with law enforcement. Mm-hmm. And I think many of us are seeing for the first time, that law enforcement, can sometimes be a pretty blunt instrument depending on the population they're dealing with. And if you're, a member of that population, the idea of being spied on from the sky is not at all appealing. So I understand, particularly in this historical moment, the sort of drive for something like this. But at the same time, based on what happened here in Oregon, I'm very, very concerned that we're going to lose a lot of opportunities and use cases that would be totally uncontroversial and are universally beneficial. That can sometimes it's sort of the baby that ends up getting thrown out with the bathwater. And I'll give you an example, is that when we had this debate in 2015, I think it was, here in Oregon, and I repeatedly went down to the state legislature to testify, they wanted to say a lot like this, and I haven't read the New York bill, so I can't speak to the specifics, but a lot like this, it's like law enforcement shall not use drones, period, we're moving on, except for a warrant in very highly controlled circumstances, et cetera, et cetera. And I went down to the legislature and testified and said, look, I get that. I'm with you there. But, as some research I just did with Embry-Riddle Aeronautical University showed, if you use a drone to map a crash site where two cars collided, you can shave like 80% of the time off that the road has to be closed while you're gathering that data. I mean, and they're not imaging the public in any meaningful way. But the officers at less risk because they're spending less time standing in traffic. The data is, just as good as what you get by setting up a total station, which takes like 2 hours to get done. And there are just a number of use cases like that, which if you can help the general public, or at least the legislatures, understand them, they go, oh yeah, that makes sense. We'd like the roads to be less congested, that sort of thing. So I really hope what happens in New York is they'll throttle back from this, blanket prohibition and, look into, where is there really no controversy? Where can drones do a lot of good and they're not capturing the public, et cetera, et cetera. And then here in Oregon, if you're going to use a drone for surveillance, you do need a warrant, and your law enforcement, you do need a warrant. And, there are a lot of cases, except in emergent circumstances, you can use one and then you have to answer for why it was so important you need to use. But the point is that you're absolutely right. There's a lot of upside to this technology. And when ideas like blanket prohibitions start being thrown around, I get really worried we're going to lose those totally non-controversial use cases where drones are nothing but a benefit to everybody involved.
Yeah,
totally agree. Yeah, go ahead, Mike.
To your point on this current moment, just going into facial recognition, it's been proven that facial recognition is less accurate for people of color. So if there was a there's nuance to what is being talked about here. Maybe that use case comes off the table to create a better conversation with the public. I think also just in general, public safety use of drones, when, there's no transparency and they launch a program, that backfires. And sometimes that city loses drone use, period, because somebody, civil liberties come into play and they talk about it. They say this is clearly, you've agitated the wrong people, or the right people actually, to shut you down. Romeo from DJI just posted something. I forget the name of the police department, but they had a monthly list of all the flights of that drone, what it was used for, how it was used to the public benefit, and where the records of what it recorded is. Things like that make a drone no different than a helicopter, just lower proximity. It's actually it's faster. It gets out of the way sooner if used properly. So I hope that in New York there's a lot going on. We had some of the biggest riots, so I think the nerves are raw, and let's hope that somebody from the police side is able to actually represent what they've been doing with drones in New York, because most of the use cases are very mundane, that they could represent them realistically and sensitively, so we can still have this program continue.
Mm-hmm. I think it's really important to separate the types of technology. So I think it's very reasonable to have a meaningful conversation about the use of facial recognition, but to associate facial recognition with drones is not necessarily useful, right? Because facial recognition software can be attached to multiple different things. Here in Boston, right, we had the marathon bombing and stuff. They caught those people with closed caption TVs. All over Europe, they use closed caption TVs. I mean, there's different types of surveillance. So I get very nervous when people really want to link facial recognition or surveillance technology with drone technology. And I think it's more reasonable to have a meaningful conversation about the level of surveillance that you're comfortable with in communities, the technology like facial recognition that you're comfortable with police using, and focus on regulations around those technologies, not on drones only, because you're not going to accomplish your goal if you say you can't use drones and what you really mean is you can't use facial recognition. Then you haven't accomplished your goal. And as Patrick said, you risk kind of throwing the babies out with the bathwater and limiting really non-controversial applications.
Yeah, it's really just a vehicle, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Miriam, I think you are exactly right. And that's another thing that we talked about a lot back in 2015 here, is what is the difference between a drone and a 50-foot pole with a camera on it? Right. I mean, the only difference is the camera on the 50-foot pole is cheaper, more reliable, and flies for longer. I mean,
and people don't notice it. They don't know it's there. So if you set one of those up on the corner of a building, people aren't looking up and saying, "Oh, I'm being watched right now."
Yeah, it doesn't announce itself with a buzzing noise. Right. So there is like a psychological thing there. I think we have to respect that, though. That absolutely. I mean, I personally I get that anxiety too. If I hear it, I'm like, who's flying that? Did they know how to fly? Where is the controller? I don't like his outfit. He probably doesn't know how to fly well.
Right.
But he's not wearing a jumpsuit like Patrick, so he must. But yeah, I think the general public who's even less informed about the technology, that fear is so much grander, because not knowing is what leads to that kind of anxiety. So the more we could communicate, the more we could have things like I forget which department again. I wish I was going to start taking notes on this. But they have a Facebook page. Every time that drone goes out in the sky, that page gets updated. So if you wanted to contact the department about something wrong with that flight, you know where that drone came from. It's a police drone. It's over this ballpark right now. So the more we could do on that level, the more we could alleviate these fears, and make sure that the states and public safety departments are able to use these drones for great uses.
Right. Yeah.
I think to that point too. I mean, during what's happening right now in our country, the political unrest, the social justice initiatives, and people are looking for more transparency from their law enforcement. And so if there's a way that, like you were saying, Mike, that that drone had logs of all the flights it did, and I don't know if it was showing other data that it was collecting, but if there's a way to kind of provide transparency through the use of drones and also use them in situations that aren't uncompromising to privacy, maybe that people will be more open to that. And so trying to kind of put both of those factors or both of those forces together is maybe where we need to go to implement something like this.
I wonder what triggered this, because I would doubt that they were using these drones to fly over crowds to assess, what was going on with protests. That's a pretty risky flight. I know that they wanted to use it for New Year's on that level, but the winds were too high for that to actually be achieved as even a test. So I wonder if there was a specific thing that kicked this off, or if it was just a general I could get my name on this bill thing.
Right.
Yeah, I think Mike, I think you're exactly right, is that fear is a great motivator, particularly in politics. And if, you can drive the politics, if you can take something that people are afraid of, and George, like you said, it's drones, there's kind of this sinister, we don't know what they're doing with these things. They're evil, so you can say drones are bad. I'm fighting them. Therefore I'm good. Therefore you get reelected. And this is not to say there aren't legitimate concerns about the applications and uses of drones, but going back to your point, Mike, there's an awful lot you can do with a camera bolted to the side of a building. Drones are expensive, as you point out, risky to operate in an operating environment like that, in a way that a camera hanging on the side of a building never is. And I think, Miriam, this goes back to your point, is we need to decide what level of surveillance we're comfortable with, what level of that, and then address that across the whole spectrum instead of singling out drones as this unique threat, because they're really not. If I was
the New York what's going to come
City
up
Police
tomorrow?
Department, I'm sorry?
Something will be invented, something new will be invented tomorrow. You don't know.
Yeah, and ultimately, if people are having issues with police at this current time in history, the structural issues that are causing that are not solved by shutting off the drone.
Right.
We're allowing officers to be armed. That's, if you want to talk about a force instrument, if they're allowed to do that, they should be able to use a drone, which is essentially just a camera in the sky.
Right.
We created rules around how they're supposed to use their guns, and if they fail to follow through with those, the system has to keep up with it. If the drone has nothing to do with that equation, though.
Right. I think this comes back to
the group of 4 drone enthusiasts.
Yeah.
Yeah, I guess we're
any bias here?
Yeah.
No.
Right. Well, that goes back to just one last point. Anthony De Molina, he made the point when working with the LAPD that the drones are not used to solve a problem after it rises. They're used to prevent a problem from arising. So, for instance, they had reports of somebody walking with a firearm. Now, instead of sending multiple police with the siren on and guns drawn to meet this person, they were able to fly over a drone, realize that it wasn't actually a firearm. I can't remember what the object was, but that stopped a problem before it even had a chance to escalate. So, when you think of situations like that, it's tough to make the case that drones are unsafe as long as we're providing transparency and the citizens are feeling assured that
less unnecessary interactions is always going to benefit all people, police and citizens.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
It's very reminiscent of what Chula Vista is finding with their very advanced drone program, is that the idea of the drone as a first responder is that some percentage of cases, but the drone goes out, just like what you were describing, Mike. The drone goes out, checks it out, says no problem, the guy's got a rate. Drone goes home, everybody's happy. There is no risky interaction of law enforcement thinking they're confronting an armed suspect. So it's win-win.